Alright, everybody ready to pretend I'm an old grandmother? Sweet, let's go. Oh my goodness, come in. You must be freezing half to death. Now, don't dawdle. Come in. Close the door behind you. Here, let me take your coat. You can leave your boots by the door, dear. Now, what's the matter? Your car swerved off the road, you say? Hit a tree? How dreadful. It doesn't surprise me one bit, of course. Not in this storm. You'd think they'd keep the roads up in this mess, but that's government workers for you. Lazy as the day is. The phone? Sorry, dear, but the lines are down. I can't get a peep out of the wretched thing. Why don't we give it a while? You can sit by the fire and thaw a bit while you wait. You look like an icicle. Yeah, that's it. You sit over there in the armchair. I'll get you a nice cup of chamomile tea and a plate of the cookies I made just this morning. They were intended for the church social tomorrow, but no doubt we'll have to cancel. I hope you like chocolate chip? I thought so. While I make the tea, why don't you wrap yourself up in that old quilt behind you? It's a bit worse for the wear, but it's very cozy. Perfect for nights like this one. Here you are, dear. Do you take your tea with cream and sugar? Just sugar? Alright then. And here you go, a plate of cookies. I warmed them in the toaster oven, so they're nice and soft. I'll have one myself, I think. Delicious. Just like Mother used to make. Made with real butter instead of... The quilt? Oh, I've had it for ages. Since before you were born, I suspect. Isn't it cozy? It is unusual, isn't it? I made it myself. Spent years collecting the bits and pieces. Every patch is sewn by hand, and every scrap of fabric has a story of sorts behind it. Not like today's modern quilts, bought in a kit and pieced together with a machine. This one's got character, just like the old biddy who made it. That's very kind of you, dear, but I most assuredly am an old biddy. I'm not just over the hill, I am the hill, as they say. Take this square right here, for starters. Isn't that a lovely shade of blue? It came from the front of my father's favorite shirt. It, mysteriously went missing one day while Mother was hanging out the laundry to dry. Poor father, he never did figure out what happened to it. Thought a sudden gust of air had carried it out of the yard, to places unknown. That man had an imagination, my dear, but he couldn't have imagined that his very own daughter had snatched it off the line and run up the stairs to her bedroom, clutching it to her chest like a newborn. I hid it in the bottom of my trunk, under the winter blankets, for months before I had the nerve to take scissors to it. And once I did, the sheer joy, if you pardon the expression, it was like my birthday and Christmas all at once, and right then, I knew I'd found myself a lifetime hobby. How's your tea, love? Oh, I'm glad. This particular brand is a favorite of mine. Why don't I get you another cup and some more cookies? You look like you need more cookies in you. And you stay right there under that quilt. It's really cozy, isn't it? Here's your tea, and here are your cookies. Oh, of course you're still hungry, and even if you're not, indulge an old woman, won't you? I don't often get to play hostess these days. I do so enjoy it. Now, where was I? Ah, yes, the blue square. Well, that one, as you might suspect, was only the first. You see the one under it? The pale, gentle shade of pink? It came from my sister, Emily. Oh, you would have loved little Emily. She was such a happy baby. Never cried or fussed. Always smiled. She had the roundest blue eyes and the softest curls. Mother always said they were the color of molasses. She was only with us for 6 months, I'm afraid, before she smothered in her sleep. The family was devastated, but I was a sensitive child and I took it the hardest. I couldn't stand the thought of her being buried in that dress. I asked Mother if I could keep it to remember her, but the thought upset her and she left a bright red handprint on my cheek, right there. Oh, it stung. And it's just the way parents raised children those days. I must have felt a touch resentful because the day of the funeral I snuck into the church and you know what I did? I was such a naughty child. I cut a handful of fabric from the back of Emily's dress, then arranged her so that no one was the wiser. She was so very cold and so very stiff, like a little china doll. It was eerie, really. But in the end, I'm glad I did it. It helped me remember a time when her hands were warm and her cheeks were pink. Mother found it in my scrap pile years later, but she never said anything about it. By then, she knew there was no sense in reasoning with me. As I said, I was a sensitive child. The time? Well, dear, it's 8:30. Yes, I suppose I could check the phone, although I doubt there's any change. You stay right there and drink your tea. Pull the quilt a little tighter around your shoulders. It's so very cozy. Just as I thought. The line is dead as a doornail. That's a peculiar expression, don't you think? It reminds me of the square all the way at the bottom. The red one. It's genuine silk, you know. I went through a lot of trouble to get it, but it was worth the bother. You look a bit drowsy, dear. It's probably the tea taking effect. Why don't you close your eyes? That's a good girl. But don't go to sleep just yet. You haven't heard the best part. You see, when my father passed on, his brother came to live with us. My Uncle Barnaby. Uncle Barnaby was a stout, gruff man with hair everywhere but on the top of his head, and he brought his young wife with him. If my sister Emily had been pretty, then this woman, Maxine, was beautiful. She came from money, lots of it, and she just loved to go to parties where she and my uncle danced late into the night. She would wear these exquisite gowns made of the finest fabrics, drenched in lace and beads. Oh, how I wanted a sample for my collection. But Auntie Max was a cold woman for all her loveliness, and she never let me near them. Kept the door to her bedroom, a room that had once been my father's study, locked every night. She claimed that children had grubby hands, and I was no exception. Can you imagine? Needless to say, it didn't bother me terribly when she had her accident, slipped in the tub and cracked her head like an egg. My uncle was distraught, as you might imagine, spared no expense for her funeral, which was well and good since her money was his now, to use as he pleased. But to my dismay, he buried her in her nicest dress, and even though I brought my trusty scissors with me to the church just as I'd done before, I didn't have a chance to use them. My uncle didn't lift his squinty eyes off me for even a moment, and I could only conclude that he feared my grubby hands as much as she had. And so I did the only thing I could. I played the part of the good child, the grieving niece. And as I bowed my head and cried those insincere tears, I waited. He couldn't watch me forever. There was a chill in the air that night in the cemetery. Not as bad as tonight, mind you, but still, the wind nipped at my fingers and I could scarcely hold the shovel I'd stolen from the garden shed. But I was determined, and by the time the sun began to rise, I was triumphantly lifting the lid of the narrow wooden box. My arms ached and I had a dozen nasty blisters on the palms of my hands, but once I saw the exquisite crimson fabric, none of that mattered. I made a small snip off her skirt with my scissors and tore a long strip, enough to wind around my shoulders like a scarf. In its place, I left a bar of lavender soap. Since it had claimed her life, I figured it could rest with her. She had always enjoyed those fancy soaps. My happiness was cut short, however, when I heard a shout from across the cemetery and Uncle Barnaby came lumbering towards me. Oh, you should have seen him. He was more of a walrus than a man, face as red as the fabric I now wore around my... Oh, your tea has gone cold. Let me refresh it. Now, don't protest. You don't have it in you. You rest right there under that nice, comfy quilt, and I'll be back in no time. There we are. Some nice, hot... Oh, tried to get up now, did you? I did warn you. Come along, dear. Pull yourself up off that dirty floor and settle into the chair again. Take my hand if you need to. I do apologize for the dust, by the way. If I'd known I'd be having company, I would have at least swept under the rug. I've always been a better seamstress than a housekeeper. Where was I? Ah, that's right. My uncle. Before I go any further, I should tell you that my uncle wasn't the nicest man. My aunt may have been ice, but he was hot as coal, and he never treated my mother kindly, even before my father passed. When he came to live with us, my poor mother took to tiptoeing around the house, her own house, so as to not disturb him. Even then, she couldn't seem to escape his temper. So perhaps you'll understand when I got it in my head to cut a little more than fabric. I clutched the scissors behind my back until he stood right in front of me, panting and bellowing words that I will not repeat. When he lifted his hand to swat me, I struck. His eyes bulged like marbles and he fell at my feet. That's where the tweed square came from. The sleeve of his jacket was the only thing not covered in dirt or warm red liquid. It wasn't a pretty fabric, but it would do in a pinch, and it did complement the red silk rather nicely. You might not be able to say the words, dear, but I know you're wondering, how on earth did that naughty child get away with such a thing? Well, after I collected my little memento, I pried apart his rigid fingers and placed the handle of the shovel into his outstretched hand. The authorities were somewhat baffled when they found him, but fortunately they were more inventive than deductive. He dug her up out of grief, the story went, and was surprised by thieves. Or perhaps he'd taken his own life, wishing to join her. And though my mother noticed my bandaged hands and the tiny red beads on my stockings as I tossed them into the fireplace, she never said a word. For his money was our money, and as I said before, he was never kind to her. Of course, from that moment on, our relationship changed. People often whispered that our change in fiancés made her overindulgent, but I prefer to think of her as sensible. It was this sense that let her live to the ripe old age of falling asleep, dear? Oh my, I hope I'm not boring you. I'll show you just a few more squares, and then I'll leave you be. You see, I've collected so many squares over the years, and in my old age they tend to bleed together, if you forgive the expression. But some of them still stand out. This one I remember, the one right under your chin. It came from a vicious little neighbor boy who used to tease me and pull my pigtails. And you see this one? The yellow gingham? I took it from his mother, who came around asking about him. My friends at the police department chalked the entire scene up to a wild dog attack, and I thought it would be impolite to contradict them. The green is from the postman, who was just a bit too friendly towards my poor, vulnerable mother. They never did find him. Never thought to search the garden beds. And this one, which I've used to patch the threadbare spots, is much newer. It's from the Reverend James, who never really appreciated my chocolate chip cookies. Diabetes, my rear end. His replacement is much more agreeable. The leathery patch next to it, covering the moth holes, came from the nasty paperboy who broke my window last spring. His clothing was terribly cheap, probably made overseas in one of those oriental countries. So I had to improvise. And this one... Goodness, listen to me prattling on. I've worn you out, haven't I? You sleep now, dear. Have a nice rest under this warm and comfy quilt. I've got some pots and pans to scrub, and I really should call the new reverend to ask if... My. I hope you don't mind my staring, but I hadn't noticed your skirt until now. Are those little butterflies? How adorable! I've been looking for a print like this for ages, I tell you. Ages. You won't mind if I...